It began with an innocuous link. Greg Stevens was a college student, knee-deep in his studies, and constantly on the lookout for new ways to procrastinate. Late one night, as he was browsing through social media, a message popped up from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. The message was simple. Greg hesitated. The friend, Jason, had been known for his love of practical jokes and weird internet pranks, so Greg was naturally suspicious. But it was late. He was bored, and curiosity got the better of him. After all, what harm could a quick look do? He clicked the link. The website loaded slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. The screen went black for a moment before a single, blood-red word appeared. Welcome. There was no other text, no images, just a small, blinking cursor beneath the word, inviting him to type something. Greg frowned. It looked like one of those old text-based adventure games, the kind you'd find in the early days of the internet. Intrigued, Greg typed, "Hello." The screen remained still for a moment before the word "hello, Greg" flashed on the screen. Greg's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't given the site his name. He stared at the screen, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. But before he could type anything else, the screen changed. Greg shook his head, a slight chill creeping up his spine. Jason must have set this up, he thought. It had to be a prank. But how had he known Greg would click on the link? How had he known it was Greg? It didn't make sense. He typed, "No." The screen flickered, and then the reply appeared, slowly, as if it was being typed out by an unseen hand. "You're already playing." Greg's heart began to race. He glanced around his darkened room, suddenly feeling very alone. The only sound was the quiet hum of his computer. He considered closing the browser, but something compelled him to stay. He typed, "What do you want?" There was a long pause, and then the screen filled with text. "Let me show you something." Without warning, the screen went black again, and then images began to flash. They were quick, disorienting glimpses of strange, nightmarish scenes, a dark forest, a twisted face grinning in the shadows, a dilapidated house with broken windows, and finally, a close-up of a wide, staring eye, filled with fear. Greg recoiled, his fingers instinctively moving to close the tab. But before he could, the screen returned to its original black background with the blood-red text. "I know where you live, Greg." Greg's blood ran cold. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was pulling information from his IP address. Or Jason had really gone all out on this prank. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a joke. He shut his laptop, his hands trembling. For a long time, he sat there in the dark, listening to the silence, his heart thudding in his chest. He told himself it was over, that it was just a stupid website, and that he had nothing to worry about. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The next morning, Greg tried to put the experience behind him. He went about his day as usual, attending classes and hanging out with friends. But the unease lingered in the back of his mind. Every time his phone buzzed with a notification, or his laptop pinged with a new email, his heart skipped a beat, dreading what he might see. That evening, as he sat down to study, his phone lit up with a text message. He picked it up, expecting a message from his friend Tim, but his stomach dropped when he saw the number. It was unknown. The message was simple. "Did you like the game?" Greg's hands shook as he stared at the screen. He didn't want to respond, didn't want to acknowledge the fear gnawing at him. But before he could think, another message came through. "I'm just getting started." He dropped his phone on the bed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This was getting out of hand. He needed to talk to someone. Maybe Tim would know what to do. Grabbing his jacket, he left his apartment and headed to the coffee shop where Tim usually studied. When Greg walked in, the warm atmosphere of the cafe did little to calm his nerves. He spotted Tim in the corner, hunched over his laptop, and hurried over. "Hey, man, you okay?" Tim asked as soon as he saw Greg's face. "No," Greg admitted, sitting down heavily. "Something weird is going on. I think it's a prank, but it's freaking me out." "What happened?" Tim asked, leaning forward. Greg quickly recounted the events of the previous night, the website, the creepy messages, the images that had flashed on the screen. As he talked, Tim's expression grew more serious. "Dude, that's messed up," Tim said when Greg finished. "But you're right. It's probably just a prank. Some tech-savvy guy messing with you. But how? Greg asked, running a hand through his hair. How would he know where I live? Or my name? Tim frowned. There are ways to pull that kind of info. IP tracking, hacking into your social media. It's not easy, but it's possible. You should definitely report it, though. Greg nodded, feeling a little better. Maybe Tim was right. Maybe it was just a hacker having some sick fun. But then his phone buzzed again. Both boys looked down at the screen. This time, the message was an image. Greg's blood turned to ice when he saw it. It was a picture of him and Tim, sitting in the coffee shop, taken from somewhere in the room. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the cafe. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, searching for anyone who seemed out of place. But there was nothing, just the usual patrons, sipping coffee, typing on laptops, chatting with friends. No one seemed to be paying any attention to them. How? Tim began, but Greg cut him off. Let's go, he said, grabbing his phone and standing up. Now. They left the cafe quickly, glancing over their shoulders as they made their way back to Greg's apartment. The entire walk back, Greg felt like he was being watched. Every shadow, every passing car, seemed filled with malice. When they reached the apartment, Greg locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains closed. Tim sat on the couch, his face pale. Okay, this is serious, Tim said, his voice shaky. We need to call the cops. Greg nodded, reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, the phone buzzed again. Another message. There's nitrogen monoxide escaping the game. Greg. Greg didn't sleep that night. He sat in his room, the phone clutched in his hand, staring at the screen. The messages had stopped, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. He kept expecting the phone to ring, for another message to pop up, for the laughter to start. Tim stayed with him for a few hours, trying to come up with a plan. They talked about contacting the police, but Greg wasn't sure what he would say. What evidence did he have? A creepy website and some text messages. It all seemed so intangible, so easy to dismiss. But it wasn't just that. Deep down, Greg had the sickening feeling that the police wouldn't be able to help him. This wasn't just some hacker or prankster. This was something else, something far more sinister. As dawn broke, Tim finally left, promising to check in on Greg later. Greg watched him go, feeling more alone than ever. He spent the day in a haze, too afraid to open his laptop or check his phone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window, made him jump. He felt trapped, hunted, like a mouse being toyed with by a cat. It wasn't until late that night that he finally dared to check his phone again. To his surprise, there were no new messages. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that it was over, that whoever was behind this had gotten bored and moved on. But then the phone rang. Greg's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. The caller ID was unknown. His first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something compelled him to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear, his breath catching in his throat. Hello, he whispered. For a moment, there was silence, and then a voice spoke. It was soft, cold, and unmistakably malevolent. Did you enjoy the pictures, Greg? Greg's blood ran cold. Who are you? He demanded, his voice trembling. The voice on the other end laughed a low, chilling sound that sent shivers down Greg's spine. I'm your worst nightmare, Greg, and the game has only just begun.